Welcome back, folks, to part 2 of our fantastic, fascinating chat with Professor Chris French, who is the director of the Animalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths College, University of London. If you didn't catch part 1, please like and subscribe to Psycho Schizo Espresso, and you can catch part 1. But now let's get straight on to part 2. Chris, welcome back to Psycho Schizo Espresso. Chris, have you ever, I've got to ask you this. Have you ever been called in to investigate any kind of paranormal or animalistic belief, and you fail to find a rational explanation? Has anything really genuinely stumped you that you think, blimey, there might well be something going on there?
Well, first thing to say is that I would not claim to have definitive, conclusive counter explanations for all the claims that have ever been made. I mean, that would be silly. I mean, one of the things I'm maybe more aware of than a lot of people would be the unreliability of anecdotal evidence. I mean, people can be absolutely 100% honest, sincere people, but we know from well-controlled studies that people misremember, misinterpret, misperceive things. We know that. In fact, the very first systematic investigation of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony was carried out back in the Victorian era, and it was a fake séance that was set up.
Yeah.
And, they then collected reports of what had happened at the séance, and they were so unreliable that if you'd taken them at face value, you'd never have been able to explain what was happening. It was all done by trickery.
Well documented in air investigation accidents as well. So what you do is you collect, if there's a tragically somewhere, like an air show, and there's thousands of people they all see the same thing, and then you ask them what happened. And then you get a million different varieties. Some of them, and by this time they've deconstructed it, and they've created their own timeline and all kinds of things. So it is fascinating. It's really difficult to describe reality immediately after you've seen it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've all got false memories. None of us, memory, to state the bleeding obvious to anybody who's ever read a psychology book, memory does not work like a video camera, and that's just a fact. But then, I mean, in response to your question, Kevin, there are very, very few things at all that I have personally investigated that have really given me any pause for thought. We've tested mediums, we've tested people who claim they could predict the future in their dreams, we've tested dowsers. I've taken part in some really, really awful TV series as the token skeptic, haunted homes, that kind of stuff. And with very few exceptions, there's ever been anything that's even, got close to denting my skepticism. There are a couple of examples of things where there have been cases where I've thought, oh, well, that was interesting, and I really don't know about that one. So I have a kind of mental box with a kind of question mark on it that I'll put that stuff in.
Yeah.
But the vast majority, no, and I'm not just saying that. I mean, we go to great lengths and we put great effort in when we're testing a psychic claimant, for example. Yeah. It pisses me off enormously when people accuse skeptics of being closed-minded.
Yeah.
Now, some are, obviously. Some skeptics are closed-minded. But actually, I have put more time and effort into directly testing these claims than most of the people who are criticising me for being closed-minded.
It's going to be very difficult to set up the experiments, though, surely. I mean,
It depends what the claim is, Bruce. I mean, sometimes it's very easy. If, for example, you say, oh, I've got the ability to kind of levitate objects, well, let's just go for it. Let's just do it, I mean, the kind of typical test that we would do of a psychic or a medium, these are people who claim they know stuff about people just using their psychic abilities. So we've done a number of tests of this kind, all in the forthcoming book, folks. Where we'll get the psychics to come in and do a number of readings for a number of different people. But they're not allowed to see those people. The people might be behind a screen, for example. They're not allowed to talk to them. They just do it all psychically. They write their reading down. And then we get all of the volunteers to come back and we give them all of the readings and say which one of those was done for you. Now, if their psychics can really do what they say they can do, there ought to be one reading there that stands out as having lots of specific, accurate detail about that person's life. When we do those tests, that just doesn't happen. And so all we can say is, well, in the conditions that we tested you under, we weren't able to find any evidence for your claim.
So Chris, how do these good fortune tellers, you hear about friends. I've never actually been to one, but you hear friends that go to, they say they were spot on. How could they possibly know that? How do they do it then? How do they actually go to Blackmore, or you go to one of these kind of conventions? How do they do it?
Well, I actually passed myself off as a psychic on Richard and Judy many years ago. Right. Because there's a technique called cold reading. Well, you can buy books on this. It's a technique you can learn. If you want to set up as a con artist, as a fake psychic or astrologer or whatever it may be, teach yourself cold reading.
Right.
And cold reading is this. There's a lot of different techniques. There's a whole set of techniques. But for example, there is something called the Barnum effect, whereby you can make certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're saying something that's very perceptive about your innermost personality, but actually it applies to everybody, or pretty much everybody. Maybe not the psychopaths that Kevin's interested in, but
they're the ones doing the fortune telling. They're the ones doing the readings, Bruce.
Yeah. Well, they probably are a lot of the time, but So for example, you might say, I'm sensing that you've got a lot of unused potential. You've achieved a lot in life, but there's so much more you could achieve if you could just tap into that potential. And we all think, yes, that's me. Or you've got a better than average sense of humour. Well, of course you have, because if other people don't laugh at what you find funny, they're the ones with the problem.
And that taps into this what's called confirmation bias, doesn't it, Bruce? Where we tend to have a tendency to believe in stuff that we want to believe in, rather than falsify our own beliefs, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the other thing that you find, I've analysed lots of readings between different types of diviner and their clients. They often ask lots of questions, which is a bit odd because they're supposed to be telling you stuff, but they'll actually say something like, what is that ringing sound I can hear?
Yeah.
And,
punching my phone.
That was a stroke of genius there, Chris. That was a stroke of genius there. We're keeping that in.
But they'll say things like, who's David? Who's David? I'm getting the name David. Now, the chances that you don't know a David...
That's who was ringing. That's who was ringing. Yes, it was David. It was David.
There you go. You see, now
it's all true.
I could just sense it. I could sense it, But there's so many things like that, The way you ask the question is in such a way that if you get a complete blank, you don't get any kind of response, you can kind of... you can change it, you can reinterpret it, and it's... Now, I'm not saying that all of these people are deliberate con artists, the people who say they've got these abilities. I think most of the time they're not. I think they genuinely believe that they have a gift.
Yeah.
But I think they're doing something very like cold reading, but without being consciously aware of it. And certainly when we've put them to the test, we don't get any evidence that they really can do what they say they can do.
The very fact that people call in one of these. I mean, you immediately know when you walk in and you're a psychic, and even if you believe you're a psychic, and you walk in and somebody goes, I called in a psychic because I'm having some some personal problems, and I want to know what to do about it. You just opened yourself. You've just opened yourself right up to the line of questioning to find out more about you, and then plant suggestions that you then say, "Oh, yeah, my God, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I need to eat more cabbage and be more, and be more nice to people, and then everything's going to be cool." Yeah.
Well, it's usually kind of there's only a few areas that people actually want some kind of psychic advice on. It's either going to be health, or it's going to be relationships, or it's going to be careers, and one or two others. But it's a fairly narrow kind of range of things. And so what will happen is that you can ask a few questions, kind of broad questions, and then kind of focus in, and people will then often misremember what actually was said. So, again, to give you one real life specific example, I remember in one situation where a young woman had been very impressed by the reading that she had. She'd been particularly impressed because the psychic had known that her mother's name was Sheila, which if the psychic had said, "Oh, I'm getting your mum's name is Sheila," that would have been impressive. It's not an unusual name, it's not that common. But actually, you play back the whole thing, and he came out with dozens of names, most of which meant nothing to her at all. But at one point, he said, "Oh, I'm getting the name Sheila," and that's my mum, and that's subsequently reported as he knew my mum's name was Sheila, which of course,
or the other thing that could have happened, Chris, is the fact that might have been the name he gave for everyone's mother. He might have tried it 100 times, and of course, all you need is that one where he hits the mark, and then all of a sudden. Yeah. This is a great psychic, isn't it? So it comes back to that baseline thing we were talking about.
Probably an Australian psychic there, Kevin. Hello, Sheila. How you doing? That's my mum's name, I mean,
and my dad, Joey.
Well, yeah. Well, and Bruce.
He's a kangaroo.
Bruce. I mean, you would have Bruce with a name
Bruce.
Like
Bruce. Sorry, Bruce.
Bruce,
right? Yeah. But we'll just call you all Bruce to avoid confusion.
But, I mean, when you said that you tested these psychics and you have it all done in like double-blind conditions, and they don't, you do it behind a screen and all that. And then, you show the readings back and, obviously none of them stand out. How do the psychics themselves react to that when you confront them with that evidence? What do they typically say?
Well, I mean, again, to be very, very clear, we actually designed the test in collaboration with the claimant. There's no point in kind of designing a test if it's not what the claimant says they can do. And we'll try and, within reason, we'll bend over backwards to try and make the conditions just what they want, as long as it doesn't affect experimental control. So we then run the test, and then we present them with the results and say, sorry, the results don't support your claim. And then typically, I think pretty much without exception, they will then decide it wasn't a fair test after all.
Yeah.
Having signed something in advance to say, this is a fair test of my claim, they will then decide, no, it wasn't a fair test after all, and make up all kinds of excuses as to why that might be. And that's just, that's not just what we find; it's what other people.
Which, of course, psychology would predict anyway through cognitive dissonance theory, and you've invested so much in it that it has to be true. There has to be something in it. Have you ever had anybody that said, "Fair cop, okay, I'm rubbish at this"?
Well, yeah, we had one. Again, I've written this. This is another kind of account in the book. We had a lady called Patricia Putt, who put herself forward for being tested, and this was I ran this test with my friend Richard Wiseman. We presented her with the results, and she said, "Well, I'm gobsmacked. I mean, I should have been able to pass that test." And we thought, oh, wow, this is nice. This is different. This has never happened before. And within about 3 days, she had kind of backtracked and decided, no, it wasn't a fair test after all. And in fact, she had an interesting approach, because on the one hand, she was claiming that nobody could have been expected to be able to pass that test. It was so kind of rigged against her. And also that actually she did pass the test with a score of 100%, which is an interesting kind of, that she could hold both those cognitions at the same time.
So I'm going to just move ever so slightly to one side for a minute and go away from people who the people making predictions to what I might call self-administered prophetic or analytic things. I'm talking about things like tarot cards and stuff like that, which go back to, I suppose, go back a long way, back to the days when you would go to see, if you're in the Vikings or in the Greek times, you would have the professional oracle, the soothsayer, who would cast the runes or the tarot cards, or they'd read the entrails or whatever. And they were, it was like a combination. They weren't claiming, they would ask you questions, and you would then come up with the answers, possibly from your subconscious or whatever. So they wouldn't exactly tell you what to do, but they were quite cleverly manipulating your own responses, maybe to guide you to a positive outcome. Maybe not. I mean, it's difficult to know where that exists now, because obviously you do have tarot card readers, and you can do that yourself and meditate on the subjects of the tarot cards and things like that as it pertains to your life, and you may come up with some good advice. But it's not paranormal per se. All you're doing.
No, well, again, it depends on who you ask, I suppose, doesn't it? Because some people do believe that there is something, paranormal going on, in the sense of something that couldn't be explained in terms of conventional science. Interestingly, I mentioned Sue Blackmore earlier. As she became more skeptical, she started off as a complete believer, a very strong believer in lots of paranormal stuff. But the more she investigated it, the more skeptical she became. And she got to a point where she said, well, why do I still believe in this stuff? And one of the things that still remained was that she used to do tarot cards, and she'd done readings for people that people said were absolutely amazing. And she believed that. So, right, I'm going to put that to the test. So she did. And actually, her first attempts appeared to produce results suggesting that the tarot really did produce readings that couldn't be explained. In other words, they produced readings that had very definite personal relevance for the people she was doing the reading for, as opposed to somebody else down the road. And then she realised that she'd got something a bit wrong in her experimental methodology, and she did it properly, and no, she didn't get any evidence. I had a PhD student who was convinced that tarot worked. We put a lot of time and effort into carrying out well-controlled studies. I mean, basically what we did here was to get people to come in. They would have a reading done. He believed he had he was a good tarot card reader. He would lay the cards out while they were thinking of a particular issue. And then they'd both leave the room, and someone else would come in and either just move the cards around, a fraction of an inch, but not change the basic layout, or they'd put down a random selection of cards in a similar layout. And then he would come back in and he would do the reading on the basis of those cards. So he's now doing a reading either for the cards that were originally laid for the person while they were thinking about their particular issue, or it's a completely random set. And basically it didn't make any difference, and so, now if people want to use tarot just to provide a framework to think about issues in their life, as you were suggesting, Bruce, well, fine, go for it. I mean, if it gives you, if it makes you reflect on things and think about issues and, come up with something, that can't be a bad thing. And some people do use it that way. Others believe it's got these special magical properties, and that's where I would kind of part company.
Yeah, I kind of get off at that point, but I do think it has some value as a meditation, because in actual fact,
and the same goes for astrology as well. I used to set my students an essay, the title of which was "Does Astrology Work?" And the best answers to that would take a kind of two-pronged approach. On the one hand, does astrology have any validity in the sense that psychologists who design psychological tests would recognize it? The answer is definitely no. But can astrology be psychologically helpful and useful for people? Well, yeah. It's a different question.
I don't personally believe in astrology. That's because I'm a Capricorn. But
thank you. Somebody had to say it.
I know. We had to do it. But actually, I'm fascinated with astrology, Chris, because one of the really interesting things is why it's been around for so long, and I think it taps into a very ancient human need to be categorized. I think we love to be put in boxes, and I think it also explains the longevity of the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, actually, which
has equal validity.
Well, which somebody once said was basically astrology for people with LinkedIn profiles. But it's like
I'm glad you said that, because I had to do a Myers-Briggs thing once for my airline.
This didn't go well, did it, Bruce? I can tell now. They said you were unfit to fly, did they?
No, I was. I forget what I was, because you get a 4-letter classification.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was basically I was quite a nice bloke,
Oh no! Total bullshit then. Total utter bullshit. Yeah.
It said, but basically, it sort of suggested I wasn't enough of a bastard to be an effective leader. I was too fond of looking after my team and making sure they were happy, you know.
But that might fit the profile of rock icon, or maybe not.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it might be even further away. But I think, Chris, I mean, that I've been fascinated with this because I think we have this human need, and of course I wrote about this in Black and White Thinking. We have this human need to be categorized. We love certainty. We love to be put in boxes, and you know, we see the same to a certain extent in the classification of psychological disorder with DSM-5. We have these boxes where, you know, we put people with certain clinical syndromes, and of course, you know, modern the consensus now is beginning to shift the other way, that actually, you know, these categorizations and dividing lines don't really mean too much in the grand scheme of things. But I think, I mean, that's why I think astrology's been around for so long, is because it, you know, it ticks this, you know, pun not intended, but it ticks this box that we all have to want to be categorized and to say, well, that's you.
I mean, yeah. I mean, at a very kind of basic level, all those kind of quizzes, particularly in kind of women's magazines, but I mean, you know, in other magazines as well, where you answer some questionnaire, you know, and then you total up your points, and then it categorizes you. And yeah, I mean, I used to love doing those as well. I don't think I'd waste my time on them now, but yeah, there's got a definite appeal. And, you know, thinking about, oh yeah, and you're this sort of person, and you know, it is a big part of that kind of, that what you're saying, you know, that it's all about, again, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what's going on, and you know, to the extent that we need to do that.
So we're hoping you are enjoying our little chat on Psycho Schizo Espresso. But don't forget, we do have a special thing for you. If you want to pay £4 a month, you can become a Patreon, which means you get the unedited content, you get the extra long episodes, and we're even going to come up with some special stuff for you. You can become a Patreon if you want at patreon.com/psycho-schizo espresso. And now back to the music.
I've got to ask you about ghosts, because we haven't touched on ghosts really. Now, ghosts. Now, I've got
to do another 2 hours.
I know.
We
won't. I know we won't. But I sit and watch these programs, Britain's Most Haunted, all these things, and I have two questions. Obviously, I don't believe in ghosts, but I have two questions which I want to ask you. Right, the first one is, why do these ghost hunters always go out in the middle of the night? Right, are ghosts inherently nocturnal creatures that, you know, that only come out in really spooky houses in the middle of the night? That's the first question. And the second question is, there's some ghost hunters which you know, actually record or purportedly record supernatural activity in EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. So the implication is there, the assumption there is that ghosts can communicate verbally or they can talk. If that is the case, then why do they bother opening and shutting cupboard doors and flicking lights on and off? Why don't they just bloody speak to us then? So why do ghosts always appear at night, and why do they bother flicking lights on and off when they can just talk to us?
Right. Well, okay. To answer the first question, I would say the two biggest psychological factors in terms of whether or not you personally are likely to have a ghostly encounter of some kind. And again, that typically doesn't mean kind of seeing a full form apparition. It can be the kind of thing we were talking about earlier, having a very strong sense of presence, or thinking that you hear a voice, or whatever it may be, much kind of vaguer kind of things. But you're much more likely to have that if firstly you already believe in ghosts. You know, if you compare people who do believe and people who don't believe, in the same kind of situation, the believers are more likely to report those kind of experiences. But also context, and that's where the night thing comes in, because you'll know yourself that if you were being shown around some old stately home and the guide says, oh, and this room's supposed to be haunted, then your mental set changes as you go in there. You notice little creaks that you wouldn't normally have noticed. You feel drafts, etc., etc. And again, you know, we know that context will have that kind of an effect. And I think that the whole nighttime thing, and again, for good evolutionary reasons.
I was wondering about that dark. These places have high ceilings. There's like hidden crevices, which would have been caves to our ancestors. And is that,
And it makes sense in evolutionary terms that if you're going into a place where you can't see very well, be more alert, be a bit more anxious, make sure that there are no threats that are going to kind of suddenly jump out on you. So I think that's kind of why they do it. But in terms of whether people really have more ghostly encounters at night, well, if you're talking about something like, say, sleep paralysis, which I think accounts for a lot of ghostly encounters, that is more likely to occur at night because it tends to occur when you're in bed. But people have what they report as being ghostly encounters in full-blown daylight, and often what people see are not kind of apparitions when they do see apparitions. They're not apparitions necessarily of dead people. You can see apparitions of somebody who's alive. As I say, I had that experience with my kind of girlfriend all those years ago, So what was the second question?
And also, well, if ghosts can purportedly communicate with us verbally, why do they bother? Why they seem to love turning lights on and off and opening cupboard doors, don't they? I mean, what's that all
because
about?
Again, I think it's a context type of effect. Any kind of anomaly that occurs if you're on a ghost hunt, something that again wouldn't normally be worth commenting on necessarily. I mean, the number of times I've been in these situations and a bit of equipment doesn't work or a light bulb goes. Or even if I'm just doing a lecture or doing a talk talking about this stuff and there's a loud bang or a light bulb goes, I'll go, "Ooh, spooky." And it gets a giggle from the audience because they know exactly where I'm coming from. If I did that during a stats lecture, they'd look at me as if I was a bit crazy. What's he talking about? So context is hugely important.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because these people, when they do these shows, they're actually, I think it's, one of the things it's worth pointing out is they're actually desperately trying to prove that ghosts exist, aren't they? They're not actually trying to. They are going to find evidence of supernatural activity, no matter what, aren't they? So they're going to interpret anything.
And they always insist that we only conclude it was supernatural if we've ruled out all other possible explanations. Well, again, I know for a fact that just is not true. They really are on a hunt for any kind of anomaly that they can present as being supernatural. Again, you get the kind of people who go in with all this kind of fancy electronic kit because they want to make it look like they're doing science. And they really aren't. They really are not, when it comes to EVP, I love EVP. For anybody, again, that out there that doesn't know, electronic voice phenomenon, the idea that you can record spirit voices directly in reportedly haunted locations. Now, there's loads of websites where you can go and play these clips of supposed spirit voices to yourself. And what boring old skeptics like me say is, well, sometimes you inadvertently just recorded somebody who was alive. Again, I remember doing a bit of daytime telly some years back, and this guy was playing his EVP, and it was someone singing Celine Dion songs, and it was terrifying. I just don't think it was a ghost, that's all,
It's probably Celine Dion, wasn't it,
It
Chris?
may well have been Celine herself.
But people believe this stuff.
You reminded me of a story, something that happened to me when I was doing this Haunted Homes series. So I was the token skeptic, and one of the places that we visited was a radio station called Radio Beacon in the Midlands.
Yeah, I know it.
And and they claimed that the place was haunted. And there was a kind of standard format for every program. They used to get people who, in most cases it was homes, as in the title, but whether it was a home or a workplace, they'd keep a video diary for a couple of weeks before we even arrived to see whether they could, record anything spooky. In this case, a couple of the DJs there were kind of hanging out in the night, or in night cameras, this sort of stuff. And one of the things that had been reported was people hearing a ghostly sneeze. And sure enough, they heard something. Now, it wasn't recorded, but you could see they both turned their heads at the same time. So, yeah, they heard something. I'll accept that. Anyway, when we went in for our vigil, as they called it, they always used to keep me outside because they know that if the skeptic's in the room, it really dampens the atmosphere.
Yeah, the ghosts don't come out. Yeah.
I used to be outside in the Winnebago, but the rest of them were in there. It's all been recorded, and sure enough, this time they actually record this sound. And of course, they're very, very pleased with that. They kind of faced me with it the next morning. How do you explain this, smart ass? And I kind of said, one of the problems with EVP is that, that might be a sneeze, but it could be 101 other things. We just don't know. We're just interpreting it within the context of these stories we've already heard. Anyway, the next night, just we just before we did the next bit of filming, I popped to the loo on the landing where this had been recorded, and as I'm coming out of the cubicle, our paranormal investigator's there, very disgruntled look on his face, pointing at the wall. And I'm thinking, what is it? Is it ectoplasmic snot? What's it going to be? And looked at where he was pointing, an automatic air freshener.
Goes,
yeah. And sure enough, we hung around, and that was it. So we kind of did an interview the next morning to camera to say, we know what the sneeze was. It's not a ghost. Sadly, they didn't have space in the programme to include our explanation. They made a huge thing about the ghost sneeze. They had it all kind of presented as spectrographs and all sorts, Our explanation didn't make the final.
Because actually, some paranormal phenomena is associated with strange odours as well, isn't it, Chris? So maybe that might might have a kind of accounted for that as well.
Been a contributory factor.
That's right. Yeah. Chris, what do you make? I mean, there's some obviously animalistic beliefs that are more prevalent than others. I'm sure there's very rare ones, but one which is very common, and I think we all probably know someone that's had a sense of this, and that's déjà vu, and Bruce had mentioned this earlier on. I mean, what have you studied déjà vu, and what are the explanations? I mean, obviously some people say, well, it's obviously to do with reincarnation or whatever kind of stuff like that. But is there a simpler, more rational explanation for experiences of déjà vu?
Yeah. There are whole books written about déjà vu from a scientific, psychological point of view. There are a number of different possible explanations. As I say, one of them is reincarnation, but that's not one that I'd put high on the list of likely explanations. Another idea, which there is some empirical support for, is that when you think about how we process the world around us, how we perceive the world around us, we recognise that we process familiar stimuli, whether it be people, places, or whatever, differently. There's something compared to unfamiliar stimuli. So there's obviously part of what's going on in the cognitive system that kind of, there's fires for familiarity. This person, or this place, or whatever it may be. And that raises the kind of possibility that sometimes that particular bit of the brain, or whatever it is firing when it shouldn't. So you're getting the sense of familiarity, but actually you are in an unfamiliar place, or you're talking to an unfamiliar person. Yeah. And certainly, back to the good old temporal lobes, sure. We know that sometimes temporal lobe epileptics just before a seizure will get a very, very strong sense of déjà vu. Yeah. So we know that kind of unusual activity in the temporal lobes can directly lead to this feeling. There's another approach which people have used is that maybe sometimes it might just be something like, say, the spatial layout of objects in a room is very similar to the kind of spatial layout of buildings when you look through a window, and you don't realise why this looks familiar, because obviously it's a completely different situation. But there is something there in the non-conscious part of the brain that is actually triggering that familiarity kind of detector. Yeah. So there are kind of other alternative explanations which I personally would see as being more likely. But it's a weird sensation when you have it. I've not had it for many years now, but I certainly have experienced it.
It's a weird one as well, because certainly you think about. I'm going to speculate. It might have been potentially more rare in times gone by, simply because places were so different one from another. No two houses would ever be the same. No two castles would ever be the same. No two chateaux would ever be the same. That you didn't have chains of shops that essentially were remarkably similar. In particular, now you have office buildings, chains of hotels where there's many similarities, across continents of buildings and situations that all suddenly could click and go, oh my God, I've been here before. I'm in Cairo.
Yeah.
I'm in Cairo. I'm at the Intercontinental Hotel, but I've never been here before. No, but you've been at the Intercontinental Hotel in somewhere else. And you know, and suddenly your brain's gone, oh, little moment here. You had jet lag, whatever. You haven't slept enough. And suddenly, poof, you know, sudden chemical synapse. Well, hey, here we go. So I find that a really interesting phenomenon, you know, that temporal lobe. And again, I suppose you could, can you stimulate that? Can that be stimulated to give that feeling? I mean,
so there's been some really interesting stuff with respect to directly stimulating the temporal lobes, or rather, we're getting off déjà vu now and onto kind of out-of-body experiences.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, again, you know, sometimes temporal lobe epileptics just before a seizure will have an out-of-body experience.
I've had one. I had an out-of-body experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, they are quite common. Tell us what happened.
Well,
you.
I was about to go on stage with third on the bill to Ian Gillan in 1978 or 79, something else like that. So I'm with Miss Bam, got 20 minutes, right? And we were supporting it was Ian Gillan, Randy California, and Spirit, right? In the second. So, like, you know, and Randy was obviously, he was a kind of like Jimi Hendrix type figure who had just taken an awful lot of acid. So you know, you'd have a conversation with Randy, he's a lovely guy, and you'd be having a conversation saying, so how's it going, Randy? He goes, hey man, it's going, oh, the sky. and then like, okay, fine, you know. But he had a bass player who was this young kid, and before I went on stage, I was just about in, and it was in Middlesbrough Town Hall of all places, right? So very, very glamorous. So we're all in this big dressing room, and he comes up and goes, here, have a sniff of this. It was amyl nitrate. I had no idea what it was.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and I went, what is it? He goes, no, just have a sniff. I went, well, it's like Vic, isn't it, basically? So I went, and honestly, I sat down very quickly, and next thing, I was on the ceiling looking down at myself.
Whoa.
And then all of a sudden went wham, and I was back in my body. And I won't say what I said to him, but I wasn't very happy, you know, and everything else like that. So it's the only time I've had when I've not been dreaming, that I've seen my body from another perspective, you know, and that was entirely drug induced.
And you get this, don't you, Chris? You said you were interested in near-death experiences, and this isn't this quite common with people on operating tables when they're kind of on death's door? They have this kind of sense of what they report floating above the operating table and seeing,
witnessing what's going on down below, and so on. I mean, and again, these are really, you know, they're kind of fascinating accounts. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that, you know, people really did experience what they said they experienced. The question is how you interpret it, you know, and obviously on the one hand you have people who interpret it as being kind of, at the very least, evidence that that consciousness can leave the physical body, and maybe as evidence for life after death. And then you've got, you know, people like me, professional wet blankets, who say that, you know, it is a very, very rich hallucinatory experience.
Yeah, and if I can hallucinate after having a sniff of a popper, and do that, then my God, being on an operating table, having some sort of, you know, life altering operation, you know, that qualifies as well, you know.
So social media, Chris, with its echo chambers, with its different kinds of cliques and groups, and you know, with this kind of tendency we have, you know, as I was saying, confirmation bias, to believe what we want to believe and find evidence for that. I mean, is this now a golden age for animalistic psychology research? Are animalistic beliefs?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, it has struck me that, you know, to some extent, some commentators kind of view all the kind of fake news and, you know, the misinformation and the conspiracy theories as if it's a modern phenomenon. But of course it's not. You know, it goes back hundreds of years. People have always come up with conspiracy theories. People have always, you know, spun the way that things are presented and so on and so forth for their own means. So but now it's so much kind of easier to do it, and of course, we're finding out more about the kind of algorithms that are behind social media that are pushing people further down these rabbit holes of conspiracy belief and so on for monetary gain ultimately. So it's kind of I would say the kind of organized skeptical movement, and I don't even like that phrase at all because it implies that for me what kind of skepticism is about is just not telling people what to think, but maybe helping them in terms of how to think critically and how to evaluate evidence.
Now you're talking our language here. We love this, because how to think. It's effectively it's the gap that's full. Well, when I did history, people say, "Well, what use is that?" And I said, when you were at high school, you learned when it happened. Then when you go to the next bit of your school, you learn what happened, and then you go to university and you figure out why it happened. And the why is by far the most interesting aspect of the whole thing. The process is by far the most interesting aspect of the whole thing. So I'm completely with you. It's how people think and how people ask the questions that they need to ask. And we're losing a large part of the population. A significant element of the population is being lost to rational discourse.
Well, yeah, I think you sadly you may well be right. It's difficult to know what the antidote to that is. I mean, we can all do our own little bit. I like to kind of think that. And the thing is, I mean, often when I'm, say, doing talks on all this stuff, I'm preaching to the converted anyway. I mean, I know that. These are people who already have a skeptical attitude. I think it would be good to get more of this sort of stuff into schools. So this is, the original kind of working title for my book, Why Weird Stuff Matters, because I think that anomalistic psychology is a great vehicle for teaching critical thinking.
Yeah.
Because it's not doing it in a dry, abstract way. It's talking about people being abducted by UFOs, or at least claiming they are, or, people who say they've got magical powers.
Chris, I just got to ask you, you've got your book coming out next... Oh, yeah. You got your book coming out next year, Science of Weird Shit. So I've got to ask you, out of all the things we've covered, we've covered everything from telekinesis to ESP to conspiracy theories, alien abduction. We've done the lot, spiritualism. Do you have a favourite? Do you have a favourite area of animalistic psychology that really pushes your buttons?
I suppose, there's certain topics I enjoy talking about more than others. I mean, alien abduction and ghosts and that. Sleep paralysis, and which is not, in one sense, it's not a paranormal phenomenon. It's a very terrifying hallucinatory experience. I find the kind of first-hand accounts absolutely fascinating. On the other hand, there's topics that I love doing in a kind of, if it's like media stuff, where... for example, talking about astrology, which for me is like the queen of the pseudosciences, and it's a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, because the arguments just don't stack up in favour of astrology at all, and the evidence against it, in the sense that we were talking about before, as being a valid system, not to say it can't be useful for people, it absolutely can. But those kind of things. Some topics are easier to deal with than others. One of the worst things to actually have to do in a kind of like daytime TV studio is to try and argue with a conspiracy theorist.
Oh yeah.
Because trying to do that is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. They might kind of say, okay, well you've answered that point, but what about this? And they're off up another avenue. So that's not very rewarding. And really, if going back to the question you asked earlier, if you want to try to actually talk someone out of maybe going down the conspiracy rabbit hole too much, like I say, a family member or a loved one, I think you have to play a long game. It's not going to happen in a kind of half-hour chat. Yeah. So.
Well, we've been on for about 2.5 hours here, I think. And so I think it's been, Bruce, I don't know about you, mate. I think it's just been absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant.
I've enjoyed it.
It really has. So Science of Weird Shit, Chris, one of the best titles of the book I think I've ever heard. When's it out, mate? When's it out?
Well, it'll be out sometime towards the end of next year, end of 2022.
Right.
So I was thinking about it. It would be nice if we could time it so that it's kind of ahead of Halloween, but if not, it's a great Christmas game.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm with you on that. I should be reading that when I'm on tour.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Chris, it's been wonderful. Literally, it really has. It's been absolutely fantastic chatting to you. Thanks so much for being so patient as well. As I say, we have been on for about 2.5 hours. But it's been really, really good. And we'll definitely look out for the book. And really, really great.
Fantastic. Well, yet another episode, yet another hour of your life and our lives, which I hope has enlightened and entertained you, obviously on Psycho, Schizo, Espresso, and there's a lot more to come. But I have to mention Psycho, Schizo, Espresso is a Pod Prod production, and please make sure that you like, subscribe, or leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can get in touch with us by emailing us at pse@podprod.co.uk, and there's the hashtag as well, hashtag Psycho, Schizo, Espresso. And don't forget, you can now become a Patreon, which means you get behind the firewall, as it were, and you get to lift our skirts up and have a look at what's going on underneath, extended episodes and some special things that me and Kevin might do together. If you want to do that, www.patreon.com/Psycho, Schizo, Espresso for all the unedited and unfiltered episodes, as well as extra bonus content.